Flashing red and blue lights cut through the night as a woman sat in her car, heart pounding, gripping the steering wheel. But tonight was different. Tonight she would turn the tables. The street was empty, just rows of neat houses with shutters drawn and gardens trimmed to perfection. It looked like any other suburban neighborhood, safe, orderly, and unremarkable. But the weight in the air was anything but calm. There, parked behind her, was the patrol car, its imposing presence looming like a shadow. She exhaled a deep breath that steadied her nerves. Her fingers, though tight around the wheel, didn't tremble. She was no stranger to moments like this. Moments where control hung by a thread, and every decision mattered. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her eyes locking on the flashing lights. Don't react, she thought. Stay calm. A sharp knock on the driver's side window broke the silence, its force startling enough to make her flinch. She turned her head slowly, deliberately, her eyes meeting the cold, hard gaze of Jim Goodman standing outside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, almost too neat, designed to assert authority. His hand rested on the door, the fingers flexing with practiced ease, ready to grab hold of whatever he needed to control the situation. "License and registration," he barked, his voice harsh and clipped. His eyes, scanning her, seemed to pierce through the glass, a silent judgment already made before a single word was exchanged. The woman didn't flinch. Her name was Monica Thompson, a woman of quiet resolve and immense strength, educated and eloquent, with a backbone built from experience rather than birthright. She had worked hard to get to this point in her life, a degree in political science, a career in social justice advocacy, and a reputation for challenging the status quo. But her story wasn't one to be easily summed up in a resume. It was her experiences, her struggles, her victories, and her unwavering stance against inequality that had shaped her. Monica's eyes never left Jim's face as she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the requested documents. Her movements were measured, unhurried, almost serene. In that moment, the world around her seemed to shrink. The only thing tangible was Jim's heavy presence and the oppressive weight of his expectations. "Ma'am, are you aware of the speed you were going?" Jim's tone was more dismissive than curious, as if he already knew the answer. "I've got you clocked at 10 miles over the limit." Monica's voice was calm and precise. "I was going the speed limit, officer. There's been no violation." Jim's lips tightened in a thin, controlled smile. He wasn't one to be contradicted, especially not by someone like her. "You think I don't know what I'm talking about? I have the radar on my side. Step out of the vehicle." Monica's hand stayed steady on the door handle, her thoughts sharp as a blade. Here it comes, she thought. The play for power, the attempt to make me submit. But she wasn't going to fall for it, not tonight. "Is there a reason I need to step out of the car?" she asked, her voice steady, but now there was a certain edge to it, a hint of challenge that had been missing before. Jim, clearly irritated by her question, squared his shoulders, his gaze now narrowing with disdain. His fingers tightened around the door handle, and his voice took on a sharper, almost sneering quality. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Step out of the vehicle now." Her heartbeat quickened, but it wasn't fear. It was the rush of adrenaline. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was something else, something deliberate. He wasn't asking her to step out because of any reasonable suspicion. He was doing it to establish dominance, to intimidate her, to remind her that in his world, people like her didn't question authority. Monica's mind raced, her thoughts forming faster than the situation could unfold. She had been in moments like this before. She had seen it, heard it, lived through it. She knew exactly what was happening. This was racial profiling, plain and simple. He had assumed she didn't belong here, that she was out of place in this quiet neighborhood, simply because of the color of her skin. His demeanor was casual, but his intent was anything but. "I'm not stepping out of the vehicle," Monica replied, her voice unwavering. "I haven't broken any laws, and you don't have the right to make me. If you want to arrest me, go ahead. But I won't comply with this." For a moment, there was silence. Jim's eyes flickered with surprise, followed quickly by a flash of anger. Monica could feel the shift. He hadn't expected this. He had expected her to cower, to apologize, to accept the role he had decided for her. But Monica Thompson was no one's victim. He took a step back, his hand drifting to his belt, eyes scanning the interior of her car as if searching for something to justify his actions. But there was nothing. Nothing except a woman who wasn't afraid to hold her ground, no matter the cost. Monica, though outwardly calm, was already thinking ahead. The wheels in her mind were turning. This wasn't the first time she had been stopped for no reason, and it wouldn't be the last. But tonight she would not let it slide. Tonight she would turn the tables. As Jim continued to stand there, his posture rigid, Monica's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. She could feel the tension in his body, the way he was struggling to regain control of the situation. He was used to winning, but tonight he would lose. Her eyes, steady and unflinching, locked onto his as she began to prepare her response. Jim had thought he was in charge, but Monica wasn't about to let him dictate the narrative. She had power too, a power that couldn't be taken away, a power that came from within, from the unwavering knowledge that justice wasn't always handed out by the people in uniform. It was earned, fought for, and sometimes you had to fight for it right in that very moment. Jim stepped back, uncertainty flickering behind his cold stare. It was too late. He had already underestimated her. Monica was no longer just a passenger in this story. She was taking control, and he had no idea what was coming next. Jim stood there, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowing with a growing sense of authority, as though trying to wear her down with sheer intimidation. The red and blue lights still flashed in the distance, reflecting off the side mirrors, casting a cold glow over the situation. Monica, unfazed, remained in her seat, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the steering wheel, her knuckles pale but steady. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground, not this firmly. His voice now dripped with barely concealed frustration, attempting to assert dominance with every word. "I told you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Are you defying a direct order?" Monica's gaze remained fixed on him, her expression calm, but there was an underlying fire burning behind her eyes, an unspoken promise that she wouldn't let this moment pass without a fight. Her mind, sharp and calculated, was already miles ahead of him. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I'm not defying you. I'm simply refusing to comply with an unlawful request." She didn't break eye contact, her voice unwavering. Jim scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Unlawful? Do you know who I am?" His tone was dripping with condescension, as if he thought his uniform and badge alone gave him the right to do whatever he pleased. "I don't need to know your name to know what's happening here," Monica said, her voice smooth but laced with quiet defiance. "You're trying to intimidate me. You've been doing it from the moment you stopped me." Jim's face reddened, but he pressed on, his voice rising. "I'm giving you one last chance. Step out of the car now, or I will have to arrest you for resisting." Monica let the words hang in the air for a moment, her mind running through every possible outcome. She could feel Jim's frustration building, his need to reassert control over the situation, like a balloon slowly inflating, just waiting to burst. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Not tonight. Her voice was calm but commanding as she turned the tables with a single question. "Officer, are you enforcing the law or just your bias?" The air between them crackled with the power of her words. Jim froze. It was like someone had hit the pause button. His eyes widened in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for something, anything to say, but no words came. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. The harsh lights, the empty street, the tension in the air, all of it faded into the background as the question echoed in the silence. Monica felt a strange kind of peace wash over her. She had said it. She had spoken the truth out loud, and now the burden was on him. His authority, his control, they were slipping away like sand running through fingers. Jim shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving from his belt to his radio. But it wasn't a confident, practiced motion. It was hesitant. She had caught him off guard, and for a split second, he was human again. A man, not just a uniform. His posture sagged, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape, a justification, anything to cover the cracks in his carefully constructed sense of power. Monica watched him closely, sensing the moment of hesitation, the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. She knew the look. She had seen it in people's eyes before. It was the moment they realized their actions weren't as justified as they believed. The moment the shield of superiority started to crumble. Jim finally broke the silence, but his words were less confident than before. "What's that supposed to mean?" His voice lacked the force it had before, almost apologetic. Monica leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "It means that I'm not here to answer to you because of the color of my skin or because you think you can control me. I'm here because you stopped me for no reason, and I'm asking you to do your job, lawfully." His face flushed red now, a mix of anger and embarrassment. He wasn't used to being questioned. He wasn't used to someone standing up to him, especially someone like her. Monica's words hung in the air like a heavyweight, settling between them with a quiet finality. Jim swallowed hard, his gaze shifting uneasily. But he didn't know how to respond. His training had taught him how to deal with people who back down. It had taught him how to make them comply, how to twist situations in his favor. But it hadn't taught him what to do when someone stood up for themselves with grace, with intellect, and with quiet strength. Monica didn't expect him to apologize, didn't expect him to understand. What she wanted was for him to think, to feel the weight of her question long after the interaction ended. She wanted him to ask himself if he was truly serving justice or simply playing out a script of bias. As Jim stood there, still unsure of how to handle the situation, Monica's thoughts briefly flashed back to her own life, her own experiences with injustice. She thought of her father, a man who had spent his life working hard, trying to keep his family safe, only to be unfairly targeted by the system time and time again. She thought of the countless stories of people who had been wrongfully accused, harassed, or mistreated simply because they didn't look like the people in power. Those memories, those voices were always in her heart, reminding her why she could never back down, no matter the consequences. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about one stop, one encounter. This was about the bigger picture, the pattern of racial bias that infected institutions, the power structures that were built to keep people like her in check. And tonight she was fighting for more than just herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever felt small, powerless, or invisible. Her question, so simple yet so profound, was a challenge not just to him, but to everything he represented. It was a challenge to the system, a system that often allowed prejudice to go unchecked. And Monica wasn't backing down. Jim's hand, still resting on his radio, twitched. His lips parted again, but no words came out. His confidence had wavered, his control had slipped, and in that moment, Monica knew. She had won. But the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence stretched on, and as the seconds ticked by, she could feel the weight of the moment. Whatever happened next, the truth was out there now, and it was powerful. And in that moment, she understood. Sometimes words alone could bring the fight to the surface. The street was still. The patrol car's lights flashed rhythmically, casting a harsh red and blue glow on the pavement, but now it felt like an eerie backdrop to the changing scene. Monica Thompson sat in her car, her eyes locked on Jim, who had slowly begun to retreat into his own thoughts. The tension that had filled the air moments ago now hung like a quiet storm, waiting for the aftermath to settle. Jim's hand, still resting on his belt, slowly dropped to his side, his fingers twitching involuntarily. His face was flushed, his lips pressed together as though trying to hold back an apology or an explanation. Either one a sign of surrender. He looked at her with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. He had never been questioned like this before, not in the way she had asked, so calmly, so directly. He had expected her to back down, to comply, to be intimidated, but she hadn't. Monica didn't flinch. She didn't need to speak. Her silence, her composed presence, was a statement all on its own. The power had shifted. Jim's chest rose and fell more quickly now, his breath shallow. He had lost control, and he knew it. His authority, once a shield, now felt like a weight he couldn't carry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the night, distant cars passing by, a dog barking in the distance, seemed to fade into a dull hum, leaving only the two of them, locked in an unspoken understanding. She wasn't going to back down, and he didn't know how to regain the upper hand. Finally, he cleared his throat, a weak attempt to reclaim some semblance of command. "Look," he said, his voice no longer carrying the same force. "I'm just doing my job. I don't have time for this." Monica's eyes softened, but her voice was steady. "I'm not here to make things difficult. I'm here because I have the right to be treated fairly, just like anyone else." He looked down at the ground, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The silence that followed was heavy. He didn't know what to say. He had been ready to escalate, ready to punish her for standing up. But now, with his own hesitation growing by the second, he realized that the power had slipped through his fingers. Monica exhaled slowly, a quiet but deliberate gesture. There was no need for more confrontation. It was clear that his response had failed to meet the moment. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, had dismantled the narrative he had tried to enforce. After a long pause, he took a step back, his voice barely audible. Just be careful next time, okay? Don't let this happen again." Monica nodded once, but her gaze never wavered. She had won, but it wasn't the kind of victory that demanded applause or celebration. It was quiet, subtle, and fiercely empowering. He couldn't touch her anymore. Not with his accusations, not with his prejudice. Without another word, she shifted the car into drive. The engine purred to life, a soft, steady hum in the otherwise still night. As she pulled away, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The encounter was over. But something had changed in her. Something deep. Her heart, once pounding in her chest, had settled into a steady rhythm. Not of fear, but of strength. She had felt the weight of that question, the one she had asked Jim, resonate not just in the moment, but in the core of her being. "Are you enforcing the law, or just your bias?" It wasn't just a question for him. It was a question for every person who had ever found themselves on the receiving end of injustice, for every system that had ever been used to oppress. It was a question that needed to be asked over and over again, in every corner of society, until the answer became clear. As she drove away, Monica's thoughts turned inward. She thought of the struggles she had witnessed throughout her life, of the countless moments when fear had tried to silence her, when injustice had threatened to crush her spirit. But tonight, she had done more than fight. She had transformed that fear into empowerment. Her grip on the steering wheel was firm now, not from tension, but from the quiet confidence that only comes when you know you've done the right thing. The weight of her actions, the courage to question, to challenge, to stand firm, felt like a shield wrapped around her. She was stronger than when she had arrived, and she would carry that strength with her, not just in her car, but in every step she took from here on out. Monica didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need to convince anyone of her worth. She knew it. And tonight, so did Jim. As she rounded the corner, she looked at the street ahead, the empty road stretching out into the night. The world felt different now. It wasn't just about her. It was about every voice that had been silenced, every person who had ever been forced into submission by fear. Tonight, Monica had reminded herself, and everyone else, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is ask the right question. The moment wasn't over. It couldn't be. It would ripple through the world, through conversations, through thoughts, through actions. The question had been asked, but it was only the beginning. Every person, every moment could carry that question forward. What would you ask if you had the chance to stand up for justice? Monica's fingers gripped the steering wheel just a little tighter as she made her way home. She felt the quiet hum of strength beneath her skin. And as she drove, she knew that the question would never leave her. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would inspire others to ask it too. What would you ask? Let us know in the comments. Share this story if you believe in the power of words.